Hi, and welcome back to Unfinished Business, where I talk about crimes, killers, and conspiracy theories. It's called Unfinished Business because the cases may be closed, however, the questions and the curiosity definitely aren't. So let's pour it and get into it. For today's case, we're going to be talking about the murder of Sherri Rasmussen, the cold case that has refused to stay buried. So there are some murder cases that remain unsolved because there simply isn't enough evidence. Others go cold because detectives follow the wrong leads. But ever so often a case emerges that raises even more uncomfortable questions, such as what happens when the person responsible for investigating the crime becomes the prime suspect. Today's case is one of the most extraordinary cold cases in American history. It's a story of obsession, jealousy, tunnel vision, and a murder that remained unsolved for more than 23 years. Not because there was no suspect, but because the most obvious suspect happened to wear a LAPD badge. This is the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7th, 1957, into a close-knit family who described her as intelligent, compassionate, and fiercely dedicated to helping others. She pursued her career in nursing and quickly earned a reputation as an exceptional critical care nurse. Friends and colleagues remembered her as hardworking, dependable, and someone who naturally cared for those around her. In 1985, Sherri married John Rutten, an engineer that she had fallen deeply in love with. Their relationship moved quickly, and by all accounts, the newlyweds were excited to be building a new life together. They had purchased a condominium in Van Nuys area of Los Angeles and had been married for only around 3 months when tragedy struck. To everyone who knew them, they appeared to be a happy young couple with their entire future ahead of them. On the morning of February 24th, 1986, John Rutten had left home for work while Sherri stayed behind. She was due to begin a nursing shift later that day. As the day progressed, Rutten repeatedly tried calling home, but there was no answer. At first, he wasn't overly concerned because this is before that mobile phones became commonplace, and it wasn't unusual to miss a call. But as the hours passed, he grew increasingly uneasy. When he had returned home that afternoon, he noticed that something wasn't right. The front door was unlocked, and inside the condominium appeared disturbed. Stereo equipment and other valuables had been moved from their usual places and stacked near the entrance, almost as if someone had been preparing to carry them away. Then he found Sherri. She was lying on the floor, brutally beaten and covered in blood. The attack was savage. Investigators determined that Sherri had suffered severe blunt force trauma injuries before being shot 3 times in the chest. She also had defensive wounds, showing that she had fought desperately to stay alive. But during that struggle, she managed to bite her attacker on the arm or hand hard enough to leave behind saliva, an act that would eventually solve the case more than 2 decades later. At that time, however, no one realised how important that bite mark would have become. This theory forms too quickly. When the detectives arrived, they quickly focused on what appeared to be the most obvious explanation: burglary. Los Angeles had recently experienced several violent residential burglaries committed by male suspects. Partially stacked electronics seemed to support that theory. Investigators concluded that burglars had entered the home, being confronted by Rasmussen and killed her during the struggle, and fled before taking anything and everything they intended to steal. The investigation immediately moved in that direction. However, several details didn't comfortably fit. Many valuable items remained untouched. There were no clear signs of a prolonged search throughout her home. Most importantly, the sheer violence inflicted upon Sherri appeared unusually personal. She simply hadn't been shot. She'd been beaten, bitten, struggled fiercely with her attacker, and then executed. These injuries that she faced suggested intense rage. Despite these inconsistencies, detectives continued treating the case as a burglary gone wrong. That decision shaped this case for the next 23 years, the woman that nobody wanted to suspect. While detectives searched for unknown burglars, another name quickly emerged: Stephanie Lazarus. At the time of the murder, Lazarus was an LAPD officer. Years earlier, she had been involved in a serious long-term relationship with John Rutten. Friends described their relationship as intense and complicated. Although they were eventually separated, Lazarus reportedly struggled to accept that was the end of their relationship. Then Rutten met Sherri Rasmussen. In a relatively short period, they had become engaged and married. For Lazarus, guys, I don't know whether her name's Lazarus or Lazarus, but for Lazarus, the marriage appears to have been devastating. Evidence that had later been introduced at the trial showed that Lazarus had confronted Sherri before the wedding, questioning why she intended to marry John. Witness described the interaction as awkward and uncomfortable. Although rumours later spread claiming Lazarus threatened Rasmussen by saying, "If I can't have John, no one else will." That exact statement has never been verified in court records. Nevertheless, prosecution had argued that Lazores never emotionally moved on. Personal journals painted a striking picture. She wrote repeatedly about Rutan long after their relationship had ended. She described driving by his condominium, watching for his vehicle, becoming emotionally overwhelmed whenever she thought about him. Some entries documented the ordinary routines of everyday life. Others abruptly shifted to page filled with frustration, longing, and emotional turmoil, centered entirely on Rutan. To prosecutors, those journals demonstrated an obsession that had never truly ended. The father's instincts. One person refused to accept the burglary theory almost from the beginning: Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen. After learning about Lazores and her history with John Rutan, he became convinced the murder had been personal rather than random. Over the following months, he repeatedly contacted investigators, urging them to investigate Lazores. His concerns were largely dismissed. Instead, detectives continued pursuing burglary suspects. Whether that decision resulted to the confirmation bias, institutional reluctance to investigate a fellow officer, or simple investigative mistakes remained heavily debated until today. What is clear is that Lazores was never seriously investigated in 1986. What's clear to us is that Lazores was never seriously investigated in 1986. Eventually, the case stalled. Months turned into years and years turned into decades. For Sherri's family, justice has seemed incredibly unlikely. The case reopened. In the early 2000s, forensic DNA testing had advanced. This encouraged the LAPD to review older unsolved murders. Sherri Rasmussen's case landed on the desk of cold case detectives. Unlike investigators in 1986, they weren't limited by forensic technology of the time. One piece of evidence immediately attracted their attention: the bite mark. Modern testing techniques allowed scientists to recover DNA profile from saliva that had remained preserved for more than 20 years. When detectives examined the potential suspects connected to the victim, Stephanie Lazores immediately stood out. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed a direct DNA comparison. Obtaining that comparison would require careful planning. This required an undercover operation. Rather than requesting the DNA sample directly, investigators decided to collect one without alerting Lazores. They quietly placed the veteran detective under surveillance. In June 2009, undercover officers followed Lazores as she visited a retail store. After finishing her drink, she discarded her cup and straw and put it in a public rubbish bin. Once she walked away, investigators retrieved both items. Laboratory analysts extracted the DNA from the saliva that had been left behind. The results stunned even experienced detectives. The DNA profile matched the saliva recovered from Sherri Rasmussen's bite mark. Experts had later testified that the statistical probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Stephanie Lazores was approximately 1 in 402 quadrillion. After 23 years, investigators finally knew who had killed Sherri Rasmussen. Now they needed a confession. One of the most famous police interrogations. Detectives understood that they couldn't simply summon Lazores and accuse her of murder. She was an experienced investigator herself. Instead, they devised a ruse. They contacted Lazores and told her that they needed assistance with the unrelated art theft investigation, an area in which she had considerable expertise. Believing that she was helping her colleague, she willingly arrived at the station. Initially, the conversation felt like routine. Detectives discussed work, bill reports, and asked her seemingly harmless questions. Then the conversation shifted. They asked whether she remembered John Rutan. They mentioned Sherri Rasmussen. Viewers watching the interrogation today often point out the moment that Lazores' demeanour changes. She begins laughing nervously and then she becomes notably defensive. And she repeatedly downplays her relationship with Rutan. She insists that she barely knew Sherri. As the detectives continue revealing details only the killer would likely recognise, her confidence gradually disappears. In this interrogation video, her expression quite literally goes cold. Her face goes cold. Her demeanour completely switches. She knows that she's been interrogated. And she eventually asks whether she's free to leave. She walks out of the interview room. Waiting outside are officers who immediately arrest her for murder. Stephanie Lazores' trial began in 2012. The prosecution argued that was never a burglary. Instead, they claimed that Lazores had went to the condominium intending to confront Sherri about John Bruton. At some point, the confrontation turned violent and Sherri fought back. During that struggle, she bit Lazarus, unknowingly preserving the DNA that one day would identify her killer. Realising what had happened, prosecutors argued Lazarus staged the scene to resemble a burglary before leaving. The defence challenged the investigation and questioned aspects of the prosecution's theory. However, the DNA evidence provided was extraordinarily compelling. After deliberation, the jury found Stephanie Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. In 2015, California's Court of Appeal unanimously upheld her conviction, a confession at last. For more than a decade after her conviction, Lazarus continued maintaining her innocence. Then during parole proceeding in 2023, she finally admitted responsibility for killing Sherri Rasmussen. The admission came 37 years after the murder. Despite acknowledging the crime, the parole board concluded that she hadn't demonstrated sufficient insight or rehabilitation. They had denied her release. She remains in prison today. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen remains one of the most remarkable examples of a cold case solved through modern forensic science. It also serves as a cautionary tale about confirmation bias. Once investigators decided that they were looking for burglars, evidence pointing towards a personal motive was repeatedly overlooked. This case continues to generate a debate about whether Stephanie Lazarus received preferential treatment because she was an LAPD officer. Whilst no court has evidence of intentional conspiracy or intentional or official cover-up, many observers believe that the department's reluctance to aggressively investigate one of its own significantly delayed justice. I personally believe that this was a bias, because if that she was an obvious suspect and you refused to believe that this was a personal attack and you just wanted to no, it's a burglar. If you would have went believing that there was a killer there, personal motive, you would have found the killer sooner, and her family and her would have had justice much sooner. Ultimately, the evidence that solved the case wasn't a witness, a confession, or even a hidden weapon. It was a single bite. In the final moments of her life, Sherri Rasmussen fought back with everything she had. She could have never known that the DNA that she left behind would remain silent for 23 years, waiting for science to finally give it a voice. Hi guys, I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you want to hear from me next in my next season, because I'm not too sure what I want to do. I don't know if I want to do missing kids or things like that to bring some attention to those cases. But let me know what you want to hear from me in the next oncoming episodes. Anyway, I'll see you next time on Unfinished Business.